Good morning. I would like to start a little bit off script to say that, by way of background, I come from a family that always spoke French. We spoke French at dinner. We spoke French at lunch. My parents spoke French to each other. My grandparents spoke French, and my great-grandparents spoke French, and their parents spoke French. Why? They spoke French not because they were French. They spoke French because it was the aristocratic, plutocratic language of that era. So I grew up French in a funny way. Carry a European passport, although not a French one, and am deeply embarrassed to be American these days. Deeply. And very proud to be in France. What you have done in the past few months is exceptional, and you have to lead the way not just for France, not just for Europe, but for the whole world. Holland dodged a bullet. Austria dodged a bullet. England took the bullet in the heart. You made a deep, fundamental decision, and congratulations. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is so different than everybody else and so contrary that listen to it, you won't like most of it, but it would be wrong for you to have the experience of coming here and not to hear this point of view. The point of view comes from a question I ask myself every morning when I wake up. I say, Nicholas, will normal market forces do what you are doing today? And if the answer is yes, stop doing it, because normal market forces will. So my job in my whole life has been to do things that normal market forces don't do. And very often, at least in my past, that was because they didn't exist, they had to be invented, and they were invented in places that were not startups. Startups, in most cases, are parasites. They benefit from the basic science that comes from worlds like mine, not necessarily from me, but there are hundreds, in fact, thousands of people at the MIT Media Lab doing that. So the subtext of what market forces don't do is in the next slide. We are a point in history. This was not true 5 years ago. We are at a point in history today where the internet and connectivity should be considered a human right. And almost nobody argues with me. Almost nobody says, oh no, that's not a good idea, but how do you do it? I'll tell you exactly how you do it. So you get a very good response. People actually say yes, especially for the 2 billion people in this world who are what is sometimes called, and I hate the expression, the bottom of the pyramid. For those 2 billion people, it should be a human right. And of course, human rights aren't just for certain people. All you have to do to qualify is be human. So the internet connectivity as a human right, I think, it's my work, I believe in the next 5 years, everybody will agree. And the rest of my presentation is derivative effects, because the first thing we know about human rights is they are free. They're not affordable, they're free. So let's look at it that way. One way, and this is a point of view, is to look at the world not as a market, but as a mission. If you think what you're doing is part of a mission, then you will follow the rest of my talk very easily. So I'll give you some background. The first piece of background is that telecommunications is relatively new in the course of history, and it has been treated like tobacco and alcohol. It's been treated as something you tax, something where the rich subsidize the poor. It has been treated as not a commodity, but as a luxury good. So if you went to make a phone call in Uganda to telephone Rwanda, which is like placing a telephone call from Bordeaux to Biarritz, and probably less, you would pay tens of dollars, $20 per minute, because it was an international call and both ends were screwing you if you were to make that call. So the other thing is there's a coincidence, and some people are too young to remember this historical coincidence. When Europe decided that telecommunications should be privatized, wireless was invented. The invention of wireless cell phone, widely used, happened exactly at the same time as privatization. So it made it possible for people to have telephone networks without digging up the streets and having this great, massive upfront cost. So that's an important thing. And then, this was particularly British and the Germans followed, something really bad happened. People decided to auction spectrum. The concept of spectrum auction is immoral. It's wrong. And governments do it for a windfall. So now let me give you an example. I propose that we auction the Bois de Boulogne. Well, let's auction the Bois de Boulogne to 10 real estate developers. Paris will make a fortune. And then we tell these real estate developers, oh, you've got to have 90% open space and so on and so forth. You don't do that. You don't do it because it's part of civic society. Yet auctions, people said, oh, we're going to auction it because we will get 500 million pounds in the case of the Brits. What happened? They got 5 billion pounds in the auction. And they were so proud, so satisfied, that all the other countries followed, particularly the African nations. The African nations said, oh my goodness, let's auction our spectrum, because then we'll get a windfall, and we'll use that for perhaps education. Maybe we'll put some in our own pockets. Auctions are a bad idea, terrible idea. So we live with them. And then we're told the private sector is always more efficient than the public sector. Well, you know, that's not necessarily true. How many of you have ridden on a Swiss train recently? That's the public sector. They're fantastic, they're new, they have labs, they have research, they have the most modern and important train system on the planet. So the private sector is not necessarily more efficient, plus its motivation is different. The private sector thinks of people as customers, and you're not, you're citizens. And being a citizen is not being a customer. So, let me give you an example. What's the worst thing that has happened to public school in the United States? I'm going to use the United States because I know it. The answer is private school. It's the worst thing that's happened because all the families that care, all the families that could afford to make a difference, take their children out of the system. And by taking them out, they're lowering the system, they're lowering the quality of the school. So it's a perfect example of where privatization has made it worse, not better. And trust me, I wake up each morning thinking that I have this enormous anchor on my back called Donald Trump. It's like an anchor. I used to wake up a little bit more bouncy, and we'll get over that. Unlike Brexit, they're stuck. We'll get rid of him. So the huge problem in all of this, which is ironic, is competition. Now, we all think competition is good. And we think competition is the DNA of progress. Well, it's the DNA of many things, and I'm not saying forget it, but it is also the germ that creates a certain illness. The worst example is education. And again, let me use the United States. We tell our children, you've got to compete. You've got to get high test scores. We tell them all the things that Montessori did not tell her children. All the things that don't happen in Scandinavia. In Finland, kids don't have homework. They don't have tests. And yet they're in the top of the education rank. And what do? We add more tests, more competition. Parents in the United States are complicit. So competition is a huge problem because sometimes you don't do things competitively, you do them collaboratively. And you're not incentivized by a profit, you're incentivized because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for people, well-being, the quality of life. So I'll give you sort of a goal. So I think, in general, if I had to look at the whole world, the most precious natural resource is not oil or gold or silver. It's not Bitcoin. It's children. They are the most precious natural resource. And it's amazing. I've spent years of my life traveling to basically every country in the world, every country in Africa. And I think I've met most of the heads of state of those countries. And when I tell them, Mr. or Mrs. Head of State, your most precious natural resource is children, they go, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. People don't. It's very important. So when people say to me, oh, do you give internet or food? And I'm saying, what? Can you imagine saying we won't build schools until we have food? You do both by definition. So it's sort of a sidetrack, but it's true. So in 1982, actually I had been working when I was in the French government. Mitterrand saw this slide before anybody. And I was trying to bring computers, and I was running this project out of Paris. Paris could have had the Media Lab, but the government would not cooperate. They were the exact opposite of what your president said last night. Had your president been president when I was here in 1982, the Media Lab would be in France. So what happened many years later? Many years later, and I'll go through these quickly, we built a laptop, and when we distributed 3 million of these laptops in 18 months, free. 3 million free. Can you imagine if I were a startup company and I went to a venture capitalist and I say, I'm going to start a laptop business, and in 18 months, I will have sales of 3 million laptops. Incredible. But I wasn't. I was a nonprofit, and I went and got them out there very fast because they were free. Then what happened? Then I went to heads of state, and I said, look, if you do a tender, a national tender, I will bid on it publicly. I'll print it in the newspaper. So Brazil does a tender, 1 million laptops with all of these strings attached and maintenance and so on. And I said, okay, we will bid $188. That was the actual price that we knew we could deliver for. And we published it in every newspaper, usually on the front page. So what happens? The tender is 2 weeks away, And every company that applied for the tender who bid, it's a closed bid, a sealed bid, had to be below 188. And they were. And it was terrific. We didn't want to sell more laptops. We wanted the world to come way down. And when we did that, we forced into what you might call the market 50 million, 50 million laptops into the hands of kids who didn't have them, of which only 3 million were ours. And why did that work? Because I had a factory in Taiwan where I could push the button and make 200,000 a week. So we were credible, and we could push it down because our purpose was not sales. So I'll go through these very quickly because I'm not trying to revisit one laptop per child, but its effect was really because we were able to lower the forces. These kids, I don't have the time, these kids, I'll show you, this is the best photograph I have in my whole life. I've never had a photograph like this. The kid on the right has nominated himself as teacher. The kid on the left is using the laptop of the other child, using the laptop of the other child, and so on and so forth. This village has no teachers, no adults that can read, no school, and every one of those children today reads, writes, and speaks fluent English and reads and writes their native language. No teachers. Haven't been since the project started. So what is the solution? The solution, first of all, is the last 1.5 billion people, not the next. When somebody tells you that they are working on a project that has to do with the next 1.5 billion people, that's a trivial project, trivial. And don't waste my time, don't waste conference time. The next 1.5 billion people can be achieved by messing around with pricing, with changing some few things. It's what they call low-hanging fruit. The last billion is not low-hanging fruit. The people are illiterate, they don't have power, they're in rural areas, very hard to get to. So that's the problem. How do you get to the last 1.5? Turns out low orbiting satellites is one solution, but here's why I like it. It is outside the jurisdiction of countries. Countries are the problem. The concept of a country is a false taxonomy. Think about it for a second. You have 195, or whatever the number is today, countries. A couple of them are 1.2 billion people. A couple of them are 1,000 people. What kind of taxonomy is that? It's accidental. And yet it is the DNA of the United Nations. We talk about nationalism if you're big enough. You don't if you're really small, and so on. So you want to get out of the jurisdiction. I don't want to deal with the telecom regulators in all those countries. So I want to get out of the jurisdiction, and I can do it. I can connect the 1.5 billion people for $10 billion. It's not a $450 billion, it's 10. That is 5 weeks of American presence in Afghanistan. 5 weeks of what it costs us to be in some place we shouldn't be is $10 billion. So it's not fungible money, but just to put it in proportion, it's a small number. So what is the next step? There are a couple of next steps. One next step is to create a new organization. Probably has to be in the UN, though I don't like that offhand. But the purpose of it is to connect everybody free. Now, let me end on perhaps the most controversial thing I'm going to say, because as you can imagine, this is workable because there are many examples of where the public sector works as a monopoly, call it military, and then subcontracts the technology and so on. So there's lots of precedent for this. There are many, many of them. In some countries, it's the education sector, and people build schools, teachers get paid. There's a whole sub-capitalistic, perfectly operational, it's at the higher level. So why? We have cell phone companies competing. That is really stupid. They shouldn't be. They shouldn't be competing. And then we have one last thing, which I have my car running outside, so I'll get in it and be out of the country before you can assassinate me. But we have a problem with startups. We have told all of our children, we've told all of our students at MIT and Harvard and other places, start a company. Media Lab graduates 50 PhDs and MSs per year. I used to count on half of them going off and doing long, hard-term, hard problems. Whether it's fusion and science, whether it's eliminating poverty, they worked on big, intractable problems. Today, out of 50, how many do that? And the answer is 1. So what are the other 49 doing? Half of them are creating these absurd little startups. Are ridiculous. They're doing each other's laundry, they're delivering food, and so on and so forth. These are stupid, small-term, narrow, irrelevant, socially irrelevant projects. But you can make a little money, and you can be successful, and so on. So I lost half of the 49 to what in most cases, not all cases, but certainly 95% of the cases are stupid small problems. And what happens to the other half? They go and they work for Google and Apple and Microsoft and wonderful labs, Facebook, great opportunities. And what happens to them? Their research is locked up. So they give nothing back to science because it's locked. So 20 years from now, and this is my last comment, 20 years from now, maybe 30, you will look back, and your children will look back, and they'll say, oh my God, what were you doing from the year 2000 to 2020? What were you doing? Because it's going to be a huge deficit of big, long, hard-term problems and solutions in science. The science isn't coming from those companies. It's not coming from the startups. It is coming from French national labs. Yes, it's coming from a few places, universities, but it's much too small. So with that somewhat provocative remark, let me say thank you very much and have a different rest of the day.